There's this notion of micro-distribution. So imagine a collection point for your community set of farms, maybe small holder farmers, and they're collecting at a central distribution point the produce and or protein that's being harvested and keeping that cool. So that's micro-distribution. Again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Then there's what we call the first mile and then the last mile. And again, I'll define those in just a moment. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Thank you. But before I define that, I just want to address this, because in my opinion, this is part of the reason that we are standing here today. The global cold chain has a significant part to play in solving some very large concerns throughout the world. When we look at these statistics, 1.3 billion is a number that the world tosses out or loses almost 1.3 billion pounds of food per year. That's huge. In some emerging markets, 50% of post-harvest yield is simply thrown away. Again, a significant number. 10 billion. 10 billion is projected to be the world's population by 2050. So we, as a globe, are going to have to feed the world and meet the needs of 10 billion people. And the world loses $400 billion US dollars of food each and every year. Next slide, please. So what does that actually look like? And I believe that in the very first presentation, the same concept came up. So in parts of the world, like the US, 50% of post-harvest foods are thrown away at the consumer level. So I clearly don't throw much food away, but other people may. But that's not what we're here to talk about. That is a problem, and it's a big one, but that's resolved through education and cultural change. On the other side, in emerging markets, 50% of post-harvest yield is thrown away based on poor handling processes and lack of infrastructure and lack of cooling. Thus, the cold chain has a very important part to play in this, and I think that this is a call to action for everyone in this room, as well as for certainly for Donald and I. This is one of our passions. How do we improve post-harvest yield? And you know, I was recently in a conference called the U.S. Africa Agricultural and Technology Conference in the U.S. And the conversation there was centered on two things. The first thing was improving post-harvest yield by improving the amount of food harvested in a single hectare, right? So how do you improve what you're harvesting? And that's not the issue. So if I'm harvesting 2 tomatoes, but I only have storage capacity to store 1 tomato, and I throw the other one away, but now I'm harvesting 4 tomatoes, but I still only have the storage capacity and the distribution channel to distribute 1 of those, now I'm throwing 3 tomatoes away. So we didn't solve anything, really. That's where the cold chain comes in my opinion. Next slide, please. And this is a bit about what this ecosystem, what this process may look like for off-grid solar solutions. You've heard from D-Grid, we're SolarX Works, and our focuses are similar but different. So in all cases, we start with the sun as our source, and we harvest the sun's energy, and we turn that energy into consumable power. And what do we do with that? What we do with that is we leverage that to drive power for our X-Cold mobile cooling unit, that yellow thing in the middle, which is a highly mobile modular solution for pre-cooling and some of these other off-grid applications that we're about to talk about. There's also this notion of leveraging that energy then to create what is called thermal mass. So you can create, you can harvest and store that energy as ice as a form of thermal mass, or you can store that energy in batteries, because the question is, what do you do with the energy if you're not consuming it? And what do you do if there's no sun to drive the technology? All of that then enables some of these use cases, like micro distribution and first mile, last mile. Next slide, please. So micro distribution case study in Nigeria. So some of you may be familiar with the organization that I'm going to refer to but not name. And there's an organization in Nigeria that we've been working with who is currently focused on the micro distribution channel. So specifically harvesting fish, so aquaculture, harvesting fish, and being able to take that fish and distribute the protein back through the country. There are specific challenges in Nigeria with the rail system and other distribution channels. And so what these folks are doing is they're setting up collection points all along the way to provide economic access, so the opportunity for people to own those or lease those facilities and then rent space. So it provides an economic benefit to me as a cold chain operator. It provides economic benefit to me as a harvester of fish, because I can harvest and bring more fish to market. And then it provides economic opportunity for me as a market stall manager, or owner, or holder, if I'm selling at a grocery store or a market, because I have more stuff to sell, right? And so that's the micro distribution channel. First mile, we're also currently working with a couple of folks on a project that is around pre-cooling, right? So it's the notion of having off-grid containers like D-Grid or Solar X-Works solutions that allow us to harvest and then mobily move those units. What's that? Mobily move those units to other parts of the farm where the harvest is currently happening, right? And in so doing, we're able to do the same thing as the micro distribution channel, only this is the first mile. So we're securing the food, and we're able to then bring more food to market, reducing post-harvest waste. Next slide, please. This last mile example is actually from the domestic US. So just because I wanted to kind of round this out from a global perspective. So in the US, the margin, the amount of money that you can actually make in the grocery industry, so selling food at market, is really, really narrow. So to improve that margin, you have to reduce your costs, which is true in every industry, right? The truth is, if you can reduce your costs by $1 in the American grocery industry, that equates to having $35 of increased sales. So by virtue of taking power costs out of your equation, by reducing the amount of costs associated with energy, you get direct benefit to the amount of money that you're putting in your pocket. And that's what so we're currently working with a couple of organizations to focus around that. So how do you reduce the energy consumption costs and provide real economic benefit back to that person that owns the grocery store or market? That's what we call the last mile. Yes. There's some innovations to watch, some technology that's emerging that will make solar that much more interesting for markets around the world. I would like to say that Solar X-Works is one of those innovations to watch, for sure. But there's also this notion of dark spectrum solar. What that means is that you're harvesting energy from the sun, even when we don't see that energy because it's dark. So there is still energy radiating from the sun. The question is, how do you harvest that? And there are researchers around the world currently working on that, and there's some interesting solutions. This is important because it provides better and more continuity for your systems to run around the clock, 24 hours, without things like battery storage. Right. Nope, same slide, please. Back, one slide. Please go back one slide. So I can speak to it anyway. There's also the notion of higher efficiency solar. So there's a product called Nanotechnology, and the nanotechnology is driving more efficiency. So right now, if you buy a solar panel, the efficiency, the highest efficiency conversion, meaning energy from the sun converting to consumable energy, is about 41%, right? With this new emerging tech, it's closer to 90%. So once again, the benefit to you for installing that kind of technology is you get more energy that you can consume at the same price point, right? So it's just a better investment. Again, these are just technologies that are emerging, they're not there yet. The other focus is on higher capacity. So the panels that you will see, the solar panels that you will see on our marketing literature, those are 300-watt panels. Currently, the industry is working on 415-watt panels. So again, in the same basic area, surface area, you're able to get more capacity. So you're able to deliver more energy. So imagine being able to deliver more energy more efficiently. Those are some of the areas that the solar industry is currently working on that'll make it much more attractive for you in the coming years. Previous slide, please. No, one more, go back one, please. No. Let me just summarize where we landed. So we talked a little bit about the solar industry. Oh, thank you. As being viable, and it is viable. It's viable for the rooftop of your warehouse if you are looking for power offset, so 20% power offset, that's a reasonably good number. It's also viable for off-grid solutions at the farm all the way to the table. We spoke a bit about the commercial warehouse and said that, hey, between 10 and 20% energy offset, that's not bad, that unlocks value. It saves you money, puts more money in your, in your pocket. I think that's a good thing. I think we all agree that's a good thing. There's a global food concern, and it involves the cold chain. So it's important for us to recognize that these kinds of focus areas that we're talking about today put the infrastructure and the momentum in place to help solve much larger problems on a global scale.
And our focus is on what we call applied solar. So we're not looking to necessarily install solar on the roof of your house or your business necessarily. We're more looking at using solar to solve specific problems around the world. So the first thing we're really focusing on is refrigeration, because that's the background Blake and I have. And as we went through the process of starting SolarX, we have a passion for that, and we feel like there's a need for solving this around the world in places that don't necessarily have access to traditional electricity. So we felt like SolarX was a good way to go with that. And as you can see, we have a background in both the solar and the food supply chain. Companies like Starbucks, Frito-Lay, and then a variety of solar companies. And really, we're here to listen to you guys and to understand what your needs are, so that we can continue to improve our product and move forward. Next slide, please.
Yeah, so one of the things we're going to do today is reiterate or talk a little bit more about some of the topics you've already heard. Earlier today, you heard some information regarding the viability and the validity of the solar industry and how it applies a bit to the agricultural industries as well. But there's still this question about whether or not solar as a macro industry is still viable. And as maybe indicated during my introduction, I have a background in solar. So I worked with Masdar Photovoltaic and worked for an organization called Mubadala out of Abu Dhabi. I've worked for REC Silicon and REC Solar, headquartered in Norway. And while I was working for REC back between 2007 and 2009, the conversation that we had about the solar industry was Conceptually great, makes a lot of sense. However, it costs too many cents to really find saturation in marketplace. So it was just too expensive to find its way into sectors like the agricultural sector and be viable. Does that make sense? So the conversation that we had at the time was it has to come down to what we called $1 per watt peak delivered costs to equal what we refer to as grid parity on the world stage. So to hit grid parity on the world stage, it had to cost $1 per watt peak to deliver the energy. In 2009, that was still a stretch. Here we are today, and we've achieved that goal in many areas of the world. Now, it's not universally true, but as we've heard several times throughout the last day and a half from many of you, the energy prices in Egypt continue to increase, right? They can continue to go up. And as the energy prices in Egypt increase, options like solar become that much more viable, and you will reach grid parity. So the cost of installing or using other carbon-based footprints, carbon-based energy platforms. Yeah. So one of the things that the solar industry has been really focused on is the manufacturing cycle to bring cost out of the model so that it's less and less expensive. Between 2010 and today, there's been about an 85% reduction in the cost of solar. Solar will continue to evolve, and the cost of solar, the manufacturing cost of solar, will continue to go down, which means the purchase price of solar will also continue to go down. Sorry, I just need to keep this closer to my mouth. The same is true for storage. So energy storage is it's the third leg of the solar industry. So there's three parts to the solar industry when we talk about the three-legged stool. The first is the process of generation. The second is, what do you do with that energy? And the third is, how do you store that energy when you're not consuming it? And so there's been a focus on energy storage that's also brought the cost of storage down. But it is not at a place yet where it is as viable as it should be, as many of you already have realized. Batteries are expensive. Sorry, we'll say next slide when we need to progress forward, okay? There are a couple of other things on this slide that I just want to point out, and you've heard a bit about that already. But by 2050, renewables will claim about 50% of all installed energy capacity. And that's a significant number. You're seeing about $13.3 trillion in investment, US dollars in investment between now and then to get to achieve that goal. So there's going to be a lot of money invested and a lot of focus on the renewable space in the coming years. Next slide, please. Okay, so the short answer is that the solar industry remains viable as a platform in many areas of the world and is becoming more viable as a platform. However, even in areas where the energy cost is high, solar still has a valuable application because there are places where the grid is either not reliable or not available. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well as we dive into the solar application within cold chain. One quick point that I failed to mention on the last slide, though, is as the solar industry as a whole remains viable, we've had some anecdotal conversations with people, and they've partnered with certain solar companies to do install or to purchase equipment from those companies. And because of the consolidation in the solar industry, many companies coming together, they've gone out of business, so their partners are out of business. They don't get the warranties or the guarantees that they were promised upon purchase. So Donald will get a little bit more into that later, but I just wanted to call that out because on a macro level, solar is viable, but you have to choose wisely the partner that you want to work with in this industry.
So considerations and things to think about when you install solar on your warehouse. Currently today, most people install solar on their warehouse as an offset to electricity costs. So they're really not necessarily looking to offset all of their power costs. They're still going to have to pull power from the grid, traditional power sources, but they're looking at ways to provide some sort of green energy sustainability story to their warehouses. So I have an example up here. This is a company called Henningsen Cold Storage. They're based in the west coast of the United States in Portland, Oregon. And this specific installation was a 200 kilowatt installation of thin film panels. This facility, I have the number written down here, is 203,000 cubic meters, this facility. And this was installed in 2010, and it cost $1.3 million to do this installation in 2010. Now at the time, they needed local tax incentives and breaks from the government in order to make this a feasible solution for them. But after all of the tax incentives, this actual installation, they had a return on their investment of 107% the day they installed it. So, which is pretty unusual. Most of the time, people are looking for a 4 to 5 year return on their investment when you're installing at the warehouse level. So they really hit the jackpot on that installation. A year later, they did another installation on a smaller warehouse, about half the size. It was a 114,000 cubic meter warehouse. They did 78 kilowatts of rigid panels, which are slightly more efficient solar panels, and that cost was $375,000. So as Blake mentioned, the prices have been coming down. Within a year, although it was a smaller setup, it was still significantly less expensive when you look at the whole picture. So they didn't quite pay it off quite as fast. It took a couple years to pay off this one with tax breaks and incentives, but that's still part of the driving factor in the business and deciding if you want to do solar is there sort of local incentives with your government that would provide you benefits that further mean to install the solar panels on the roof. A few more things. Can we go back to the last slide? So a few other things here I want to talk about is there's this idea of selling back to the grid, or if you produce more power than you consume, then the local utility district will have to buy the power back to you. And this is pretty common practice in the United States. And so with installations on warehouses specifically in the United States, they don't do this too often because they consume so much power. Most of the time, the power they get from their panels don't produce enough to sell back. But on cool days, and if they're running the refrigeration systems slightly less, then they can actually sell back some power to the grid. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. A few things to look at. I like to pull this chart up. This chart kind of shows you throughout the day what it looks like to produce power using solar. So you have this time frame. Example is in Los Angeles in the US, but the shape of this bell curve can be used throughout the world. It really shows you that between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. is really when you're getting your peak power from your solar panels. So the different lines in this chart are based on how the panels are situated on your roof of your building. If you have a tracking system, which a tracking system allows the panels to move as the sun moves ahead, you're going to get the most energy out of your panels. The next best option is, if you're in the northern hemisphere, is to have your panels face south. That's going to be your next best option for the direction your panels are facing.